Here's the agenda for today. I'm going to provide an overview of the fund, then I'm going to walk you through the components, then we're going to talk about the application process, and at the end we'll have some time for Q&A. If questions come up for you during the presentation, feel free to enter them into the chat. We've got some staff from the fund here today to monitor the chat and try to get your questions answered during the duration. So let's go to the overview. The 100,000 plus historic houses of worship across America contribute significant value to their communities. Sacred places function as hubs for social service programs. They provide essential space for community gatherings and social justice activities, and host a variety of arts programming, all frequently at no cost or low cost. The National Fund exists to support these congregations and their buildings, and ultimately to advance the common good. The fund launched in 2016 with a $14 million grant from the Indiana-based Lilly Endowment. We're forever indebted to them for making this program possible. And since then, the National Fund has awarded over $9 million to 82 congregations across the country. Those 82 congregations represent 22 different faith traditions across 37 states, including Washington, D.C. The National Fund is a program of Partners for Sacred Places in collaboration with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Partners for Sacred Places is the only national non-sectarian nonprofit dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of our nation's older and historic sacred places. For over 30 years, we've empowered congregations to care for their buildings and share them with their communities. And in just a moment, you're going to hear a word about the trust. This is your National Fund team. It consists of staff members from both Partners for Sacred Places and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. On the Partners for Sacred Places side, there's Bob Yeager, our president, Gianfranco Grande, our executive vice president, who you met just a moment ago. He opened us up. Myself, Rachel Hildebrandt, I'm the director of the National Fund, and my colleague, Emily Scheidock. I'm going to ask Emily to introduce herself.
Sure, yes, good morning. My name is Emily Scheidock. I'm Senior Project Manager at Partners, as Rachel said, and I'm joining you from cold and snowy Chicago.
Thank you, Emily. And at this point, I'm going to ask Jennifer Sandy at the National Trust to introduce the trust and herself.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. I'm really glad to be here today. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is a partner on this program with Partners for Sacred Places, and we're a privately funded nonprofit organization founded more than 70 years ago. We work together to save America's historic sites, tell the full American story, build stronger communities, and invest in preservation's future. And the National Fund for Sacred Places is a really key part of all of those goals. So as I said, I'm a field director here at the National Trust, and I manage the National Fund team, which includes several colleagues who are on the call today. Olivia Terraconi, who is our preservation architect, Emily Kahn, who is a program coordinator, and I'll ask her to introduce herself in a moment. She's busy answering questions in the chat and the Q&A, which we appreciate. And then two other members of our grant staff, Nikki Van and Diana Maxwell. So, Emily Kahn, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Hi, my name's Emily Kahn. I'm the program coordinator of the National Fund for Sacred Places on the National Trust for Historic Preservation side. So I really help with the everyday operations of the fund and assist in all aspects of the fund, from application review and general inquiry and outreach, content production, and later on technical assistance as well. So I will be in the chat answering questions as much as possible, and if we don't get to them, we will try to answer them at the end as well. But best of luck to everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, guys. Credit also goes to our advisory committee, which is comprised of clergy folks, thought leaders, and preservation professionals. They help to guide our grant making decisions, which, as you can imagine, can be very difficult at times when we've got 300 congregations applying and can ultimately only fund 12 to 15. So what does the National Fund Grant Program provide to its participants? The National Fund is not your typical grant program where once you're accepted, you get the funds at the outset. We provide training, technical assistance, and planning grants before we provide the capital grant. And I'm going to walk you all through each of these items now. Here's a timeline, a typical program timeline. Notifications go out in October, and then shortly after these notifications go out, the congregations that have been accepted into the program will attend a training/orientation. That typically takes place in person over the better part of a week. All congregations are also offered the opportunity to receive a planning grant and pro bono technical assistance. Planning grants have to be used within the first 12 months of program entry, and technical assistance needs to be used within the first 15 months or by the end of the following year. So for the cohort that's coming in this year in October, that means by the end of December of next year, of 2023. Then comes the capital grant. In order to access the capital grant, your congregation must meet certain project planning and fundraising benchmarks. With that being said, most congregations meet those benchmarks within 1 year of program entry. At that point, congregations can start construction on their projects. Construction takes about a year. So when all is said and done, the program takes about 2 years total to work through. So then training. I'm going to talk a little bit about training, what that is. Congregations that are accepted into the program are asked to jump in immediately and attend our training. The training is intended to ensure that everyone has the foundational knowledge necessary to undertake a capital campaign. It's also a great opportunity for congregations to mix and mingle. Our congregations typically represent different geographies, different faith traditions, and different racial and ethnic backgrounds. They also vary tremendously in terms of their experience undertaking these kinds of significant capital projects. Some have had a lot of experience with these types of projects in the past, and then others have had little to no experience. So we find that it's really enriching and rewarding to bring everybody together at the training shortly after we announce the cohort. At the training, we cover the basics of the National Fund to make sure everybody understands the program. We cover capital project planning, community-wide fundraising, friends groups and supporting organizations, as well as crafting a case for support. The training is mandatory. It's in person if possible. The last 2 years, we haven't been able to do it in person for obvious reasons. We ask each congregation that's been accepted into the cohort to assemble a team of 3 to 5 people to send to this training. We cover those costs. So we cover the flights, the lodging, the food, because we know that it's an expense. Technical assistance. We want every congregation that we accept into the National Fund to be successful and ultimately to complete a major capital project that either extends the life of the building or makes it more functional. That's why we offer these specific types of technical assistance. We offer case statement review, economic halo effect studies, community engagement services, professional services guidance, and fundraising mentorship. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on what each of these entails. The important thing to know at this point is they're designed to help you do 2 things. They're designed to 1, help you reach your goal, and 2, build your capacity for this type of work should you need to do it again in the future. And all of you, I am assuming, are taking care of big old faith tradition buildings, big old congregational buildings. You will have to do it again in the future. Congregations have 18 months to take advantage of these formal offerings, which are totally pro bono. Planning grants. Each congregation is offered a planning grant of up to $5,000 that can be used for conditions assessments and architectural planning, capital campaign consulting, or the creation of marketing materials. These planning grants are intended to help you get started with your project. And we typically encourage congregations to assess their buildings before finalizing their National Fund scope of work, if they haven't already done that. But if the congregation has already done that, these funds can be used to pay for capital campaign consulting or the creation of marketing materials. Several past participants have used the fund to create videos, for example, which I have really enjoyed seeing. And last but not least, the capital grant. Our capital grants range from $50,000 to $250,000, and it is a matching grant. That means grants under $100,000 require a 1-to-1 match, and grants over $100,000 require a 2-to-1 match. For example, if a congregation is receiving a $100,000 grant from us, that requires them to raise an additional $100,000 towards the cost of their project. And then if a congregation is coming in at $200,000, for example, that requires a $400,000 match. This type of requirement is very common, and it's there to ensure that our money is used to leverage additional new money. And related to that, all matching funds must be new money raised after entry into the program. So if you've started to fundraise already and have, say, 10,000 in the bank or 50,000 in the bank that's been earmarked for your project, that money cannot count towards your match. But here's what can count towards your match. Gifts from individuals, foundations, or corporations, government grants, proceeds from the sale of stock or real estate, matured bequests if they mature during the grant period, proceeds from events and fundraisers, and donated materials and professional services. An example of that would be donated slate for a roof replacement or pro bono design services. Donations, anything provided in kind, can count up to 20% of your match. The value of what is donated will be based on fair market value. And typically we ask any grantees that are planning to use anything in kind as part of their match to be in touch with me to ensure that the pledged amount is properly documented and determined. Capital grant disbursement. I mentioned before, our grant is a little bit different than your typical grant where you get accepted into the program and then you get the money. Our congregations have to meet these two benchmarks before receiving any funds. You've got to raise a quarter of your required match, and that can be pledged or in hand. And you've got to produce for our review construction-ready architectural documentation describing the entire scope of work for your national fund project. At that point, when you can show us that you've raised a quarter of the match and you've got those documents, you'll submit almost a separate application, which we'll review. And upon acceptance of that documentation, you get the first half of the money. At that point, construction can begin. And then the remaining half is dispersed upon completion of your project. So in a nutshell, you don't start construction until you've reached these benchmarks. When you've reached these benchmarks, you submit a kind of a mini application to us, which we review. Once everything is thumbs up, you get the first half of the money and you start construction. And then when you finish construction on the National Fund scope of work and what you've identified as the National Fund scope, you get the rest of the money. Please note, I said this, and I just want to emphasize this. Construction on the National Fund scope of work cannot begin until our team has approved the capital grant submission documentation. And along those same lines, we do not fund work that has already begun or that is recently wrapped up. So let's talk about what we will pay for, what our funds can cover. We pay for significant repair and restoration projects that involve foundations, roofs, masonry, windows, gutters and downspouts, towers and domes, mechanical systems that keep a building functional like HVAC and wiring, life safety and fire suppression systems, and we also pay for ADA accessibility projects. Here's a list of what we don't fund. We don't fund the demolition of character-defining architectural features, the purchase or lease of property, new construction, landscaping or fencing, cemeteries, parking lots, religious art restoration, such as mural restoration, pipe organ restoration or replacement, the purchase of AV equipment, or pew replacement. All right, so let's take a moment to talk about the application process. So this is the timeline for 2022. The LOI already opened. It opened on January 18th. and it's due on March 7th at midnight Hawaii time. It's really important to note that this is a two-step application process. So the LOI is the first step in the process. A number of the congregations will be advanced to the second stage, which is called the full application. By June, you'll know whether or not you're going to be advanced to the full application stage. And if you are, that full application is due on July 18th. Between July and October, our team reviews all of those applications and notifications go out in October. And just to give you a sense of the numbers here, I mentioned before, last year we received 305 LOIs. But then we invited about 30 congregations to submit full applications and then funded 15. All right, so let's talk eligibility. In order to qualify for the fund, your property must be located in the United States or in a US territory, must be owned by a congregation or active community of faith. We know many of you are part of a Catholic denomination or a Presbyterian denomination, for instance, and your building may not be owned by the congregation itself. That's absolutely fine. That's fine too. The applicant must be a congregation or closely affiliated nonprofit. And if the applicant is a congregation, it must be at least 3 years old. So these are our evaluation criteria. I'm going to walk you through each of these categories so that you understand what we're looking for in our applicants. We're looking for, just in broad strokes, historic, cultural, or architectural significance, community serving congregations, a fit in terms of project scope and a demonstrated need, readiness to take on a campaign and all that goes along with that, healthy congregations, and strong applications. And in addition, it's not noted here, we do prioritize cohort diversity. We seek to assemble a cohort that's diverse in terms of geography, faith tradition, and racial and ethnic makeup. All right, significance, historic, cultural, architectural significance. Successful applicants are able to demonstrate their place in American history by answering these types of questions. Does the building tell a story relevant to our American history, either cultural or religious? Is the building the work of an architect? If so, is it a really good example of that architect's work? Is the building an exceptional example of its style or type? Does the building have a great physical presence in its community based on its siting or location? I also want to note, because we get a lot of questions about this, your building does not have to be on the national, state, or local register to qualify for the fund. However, if your building is on one of those registers, or if it's been deemed eligible for one, that's a good indicator that you're going to check this box for us. One more thing I just remembered. Another common question we get is, our church is historic, but we need to invest in our parish house or our school. Will you fund our project if it's not focused on the historic main building? Yes, the answer to that is yes. We'll consider those. Community serving congregations. And we're looking for congregations that are outward focused and committed to service. So we're looking for congregations that do things like the following: operate and host programming that serves vulnerable and at-risk populations, shares space with non-affiliated groups and organizations, partners with others, and has a widespread reputation for being a welcoming center of community life, just to name a couple of examples. Project scope and need. We talked a bit about what we fund and what we don't fund already, but I just want to underscore, we fund historic preservation projects that address either urgent repair needs and life safety, or projects that increase a congregation's ability to serve folks in the community. All of our projects must adhere to the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. That's a universally accepted framework for doing work to older and historic properties. I don't expect you all to necessarily be familiar with those standards, but we do expect you to work with architects and other building professionals who have experience with older and historic properties. If they have that right kind of experience, they're going to be familiar with the standards and they're going to be able to apply them to your project. Readiness. We are looking for congregations that ultimately are ready to undertake a capital campaign and a major project. In order to do that, you need to understand your building's needs. You need to have a realistic fundraising goal generated with the help of qualified preservation professionals. So condition assessment, essentially. That's not a requirement per se, but we do like to see that, the project that you come to us is based on some knowledge of what's going on with your building. And we also like to see that you have experience with fundraising, or if not, you're planning to work with a fundraising professional. Healthy congregations. The National Fund prioritizes healthy, stable congregations so that our investment is truly impactful and lasting. We look for the following as benchmarks: tenured, well-respected clergy, capable lay leadership, stable or growing membership, financial strength and stability, support of the judicatory or governing body if applicable, and a history of weathering congregational challenges with resilience. Just an important note on this one. You don't have to check every single one of these items in order to qualify for the fund. These are just an idea of what we're looking for. I think we recognize that some congregations are going to be between clergy, maybe being served by interim clergy. We know that COVID, for example, has impacted a lot of congregations, not in a good way necessarily. So, we take that stuff into consideration. These are just some like general things we look for. And last but not least, strong applications. We are a very competitive program, so we urge you to put your best foot forward. Applications should be completed in full with all required attachments, should make a compelling case for support, should clearly articulate the project's goals and components, and should include high quality, high resolution photographs that help us fully appreciate your buildings. This year, we're accepting up to 6 photographs. So we want to see the exterior, the interior, and ideally at least one photo of your building in use with people in it and activity going on. Cohort diversity again. This map shows where all of our current and past participants are located. As you can see, we've funded quite a few in the Mid-Atlantic. We've funded a good number in the Midwest. There's a smattering out west and in the South, but there are certain parts of the country we just really haven't been able to reach yet, like the Dakotas, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Florida, Georgia. And we're hoping in the next couple of years to expand our reach to these places we have not reached before. All right, so location of the LOI. I know some of you have probably already gotten started, but if you haven't and you're ready to get started, please go to fundforsacredplaces.org, how to apply online, or just backslash apply. And if you click that button, middle purple, submit your letter of intent, it'll take you to the LOI. So once you click on that button, this is what you're going to see. This is Foundant. This is our grant software. If you've applied before, you're going to use the same credentials you used in the past to sign in. If you've never applied before, you're going to have to create an account. So to begin the application, once you've either signed in or created your account, you're going to see on your dashboard, National Fund for Sacred Places 2022. Tells you, we're accepting submissions from 118 to 307. There's that blue apply button in the top right. Click on that to get started. If multiple people from your congregation want to contribute to the LOI, Foundant has a way to allow that. There is a blue collaborate button. It's got an icon with 2 people. Go ahead and click on that and you'll be prompted to add their contact information. That'll link them to your core account for your institution, and all of you can work on that. This is really important. How to submit the LOI. This is set up so that you can work on it, save your work, return to it if you'd like. That's probably the most practical thing for most people. To save the application and return to it, there is a Save Application button. It's the gray one on the left. But when you're finished, make sure to submit your application. In order to submit, click that blue Submit Application button on the bottom right. That'll notify us that it's been submitted. If you don't submit it, we won't receive it. So make sure when you're finished, you go ahead and submit that application. And with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
All right, great. Well, there are a lot of really great questions in the chat and the Q&A. We'll do our best to get to all of them. I think we'll probably start with questions that are a little more general that apply to multiple folks, but I see there are some really specific questions from potential applicants about eligibility of specific places. So if we're not able to address those in the conversation today, we'll be sharing contact information. So you can feel free to reach out to us directly and we'll get back to you on those specific scenarios, but probably just to answer a couple of questions that came up repeatedly, just to be sure everyone has this information. We will be posting a copy of the presentation on the website for the National Fund, and that is fundforsacredplaces.org. And that's been in the chat a few times. And actually, it is a brand new website. We just launched last week, and we are very hopeful that it will answer a lot of the questions that we're hearing today. So please do check it out. We also on that page have all of the 82 congregations that have participated in the program to date and a map, and you can look at different projects based upon location or denomination if you'd like to see the types of projects we've previously funded, which we think could be really helpful for many of you on the call today. So please do go check that out, and it also has a link to contact us on that website. And we are going to try to save the chat as well, so stay tuned on that. I know there have been a couple of requests for that as well. All right, so there was a question early on about why only 5% acceptance, applications not accepted, or only so much funding available. Do you want to speak to that, Rachel?
Yeah. So this program is funded by the Lilly Endowment, and they gave us a certain amount, and then we've got a certain amount to give each year. Typically, we select between 10 and 15 congregations each year, and that's always how we've done it. Limited funding means limited number of congregations. We would love to be able to serve a greater number of congregations in the future. That's always been a goal of ours. But for now, the funding essentially determines how many congregations we can fund based on our award amount, which again is 50 at minimum, 250,000 at max.
Right, and we, just to add to that, we have 2 more funding rounds available before the conclusion of the grant that we currently have. So we're obviously hopeful to, to renew the support and expand the support so we can serve more congregations, as Rachel said. But at this point, 2022 and 2023 will be the last 2 funding rounds. So if you're looking ahead to the future, that's important to know.
Yeah.
Okay, we had a number of questions about eligibility of different types of properties. So Rachel, you talked about whether, the main worship space, does it have to be focused on that? And it doesn't, although if it is focused on another building on your campus, we do want that building to also have historic, cultural, architectural significance. So you'll need to talk about that in the application. But there's some questions about cemeteries, shrines, monasteries, non-denominational contemplative spaces. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of assess eligibility on a case-to-case basis. So it's hard to kind of speak in like super broad strokes. Cemeteries, we don't fund. Monasteries, we don't fund. Really, we don't fund any buildings that are owned by congregations or closely affiliated nonprofits.
Yeah, the eligibility criteria kind of specifically, not only does it need to be owned by an active community of faith, but it has to also have been originally built to be a house of worship. So sometimes there are buildings that are constructed for other purposes and that become a house of worship, and those this time are not eligible. And to speak to the closely affiliated nonprofit piece that we've got some questions about, Rachel, do you want to answer what do we mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So a closely affiliated nonprofit is like a friends group or a preservation trust. So like Friends of St. John Church or St. John Church Preservation Trust. So we're looking for nonprofits that are directly tied to the congregation and exist to support the congregation or the building in a direct way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we had a number of questions about the National Register of Historic Places, how old buildings need to be. So I know you kind of talked about that, Rachel, but do you want to just sort of expand on that a little?
Yeah. As a general rule of thumb, we're looking for buildings that are 50 years old or older. And like I said, if the building's on the national, state, or local register, that's great. That's definitely an indicator that you have what we're looking for and that you're going to check that box. That's definitely not a requirement though. But in the application, we are looking to see that you can demonstrate that you have regional, state, or national significance. And that means we're not looking for like a long list of the pastors that have served your congregation or anything like that. We really want you to tell us your story, tell us why your congregation and your building matter in the bigger, larger scheme of things. Because like I said, there are a lot of congregations interested in this fund, and we have to make sure our funds are invested in buildings that are important to our history.
Yeah. And sort of a dovetailing onto that, a more specific question about a congregation that's not active within the church building, but it is on the National Register, and their goal is to redevelop the property for mixed use, which would include a worship space. And I think my reading of the eligibility criteria is that that would not be eligible because the property does need to be owned by an active community of faith. But we have certainly funded projects where there's extensive space sharing within a building. So there may be one or even more congregations in a building, but also housing nonprofits or arts groups, or, you know, a kind of a wide variety really of partners. So we want to be clear that it's not necessarily about just, you know, having an active congregation, but it is about that community use. Do you want to add to that, Rachel?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good answer. There's always some gray area with some of this stuff. Like you said, Jennifer, community use and space sharing is important to us. So we love to see that a congregation is doing that. But if that's the main purpose of the building, and you know, housing a congregation is secondary to all of that, probably not a fit for this program.
Yeah. But again, we're happy to answer follow-up questions or have conversations with anyone that has, you know, a unique scenario or something that they want to make the case to us. So we had a lot of questions about timing and about capital campaigns and when construction, you know, can or cannot begin. And we often get a lot of questions about what if we're already in the midst of a project, you know, perhaps it's a phased project and congregations are working on phase one, but they want to apply to us to support a second phase. And that phasing applies both to the actual capital project, but also the capital campaign and the fundraising piece. So can you talk a little more, Rachel, about how we look at the timing on both of those aspects?
Yeah, sure. So we frequently fund projects that are in a second, third, or fourth phase, where a significant amount of work has already taken place or is underway. That's absolutely okay. What we say though is if you have some really imminent urgent work that needs to happen soon, don't plan around this program. You know, it's important to do that work and not count on this grant coming through, because like we shared, it's very competitive. But if you've got urgent work to do, but then you've got to do other work down the road, certainly consider us for that other work down the road.
Yeah. So we, as we talked about in the presentation with the fundraising piece, we can't count anything towards the match if it has been given or pledged prior to acceptance into the program. So for this year, that will be October. So, if you're thinking of applying to the fund, you may want to, have sort of preliminary conversations with potential funders, but don't get to the point where you have a pledge or you have a firm commitment, because if those commitments are made before October, you wouldn't be able to count it towards the match. And similarly with the construction work, as Rachel said, urgent projects, please don't hold off on those urgent projects for this. It does require a bit of planning and timing. Once if you are accepted into the program in October, then we would work with you, as Rachel outlined in the presentation, through the training and through technical assistance to look at your architectural planning documents and then move you towards approval of the specific project. So it definitely does take a bit more time. And so there's more, I think there's some additional questions around, is a capital campaign required, or could a congregation meet the match requirement with existing funds or with funds that are coming from an endowment? So we want to get a little more specific on that.
Yeah, in short, no. In order to meet our matching requirement, all funds must be new funds. So from October on, new funds have to be raised in order to meet that match. And that can be from any number of those sources I mentioned, grants, individual gifts, foundation gifts, government grants, any of those things count. But yeah, endowments, building funds, none of that would count.
Okay, we've got some questions from people who submitted last year. The first kind of big picture question is, if you submitted last year and you would like to reapply, can you do that?
Yes. Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And some folks had asked, they submitted last year and they didn't receive any feedback. And some of that is just due to the really large volume of LOIs we receive. But certainly if you want to reach out to us, if you did apply last year and you want to reach out to us and have a conversation, if there's anything that we can share in terms of feedback, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, sometimes we have really good tangible feedback to share, and we actually do try to make a point of letting those congregations know, this is what we think, this is how you can strengthen. But sometimes it's really just a matter of volume, and there were other projects that were more urgent where the need was higher and it was very clear that they couldn't do it on their own. They needed us, a lot of times that is why your congregation doesn't advance. There's great need out there.
Additional questions about submitting an LOI last year. Are there changes this year to be aware of? And is it still acceptable to use pre-COVID numbers for Sunday attendance or programs?
More or less, the application is the same. We did expand the number of photos that you can include. Before, I don't remember the exact number, but now it's 6. Pre-COVID numbers. Jennifer, Emily, do you have a thought on that one?
Yeah, I think we try to create some flexibility in the form so that just to specify what numbers you're sharing. I mean, obviously we all recognize the past 2 years have been, remarkably challenging in many ways. So just share with us the best information you have and be clear about what those numbers refer to.
Yeah,
there's a couple of additional questions, small ones, such as whether or not you've been hosting in-person or hybrid or virtual services, all of which are fine. We also have a question on the challenges COVID has presented your congregation, but the LOI form is very comparable to the 2021 version, but not identical. So you do need to submit a new version of the form if you intend on applying again, although you may be able to copy and paste some information with some of the previous questions.
Thanks for that clarification. There were some questions around the training. Where is it held? And then a kind of related question is about the planning grant. How does that work? Do you have to, if you're accepted into the program, do you have to apply for the planning grant, or is it a part of the grant process?
Sure. Yeah. The training, like I said, we're hoping to do it in person this year, and we were hoping to do it in person last year too. Last year, the plan was to do it in Philadelphia. So I think because that was not able to happen, that will be what we attempt to do this year. That is not 100% set in stone though. The way that that works is any congregation that's made it to the full application stage will be given the dates for the training and asked to put a hold on their calendars for it. Just because the training comes so soon after the announcement of the cohort. So we want to make sure people have those dates on hold and the ability to make arrangements. And then the second part of the question was
Planning grants.
planning grants. Okay. Yeah, there is a separate application. It's in Fountain, which is the same system used to submit the LOI and the full application. It's really pretty minimal. It's pretty simple because we don't want it to be complicated or difficult to access that planning grant. But technically, yes, it is a separate process.
And a question about in the LOI, do people indicate whether they're focused on the 1-to-1 or the 2-to-1 match?
Yes, just because the number tells us whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. So if you request a $100,000 grant, you specify the amount you're requesting in the LOI. So definitely start thinking about that. The number tells us if it's 100, then we know you're gonna need to raise 100. If it's more than that, we know that you're gonna need to raise 2 times.
Yeah. Here's a question about architects and RFPs. Does there have to be a new RFP process to select a new architect for the project, or can architects that have already been approved for the project be used?
I mean, yes to both. We've seen congregations come in with architects that they've had long running relationships with that haven't gone through an RFP or bidding process. They just know, this is phase 2 or phase 3, and we want to work with the same architect. That's generally fine, but we work with congregations case to case to kind of assess that and make a recommendation.
Yeah. Okay, does acceptance of the letter of intent guarantee an acceptance for the application later on?
Does acceptance of the letter of intent. So it's a 2-step application process, and the way that it works is the LOI is open to anybody who would like to submit. Then we're going to advance a small percentage of the congregations that submitted an LOI to the full application stage. So if you hear from us in the summer and we say, we would like to advance you to the full application stage, that guarantees that you can move on to the second step in the process. But that's all that guarantees.
Yeah, it doesn't, if you are invited to submit a full application, it does not mean that you will necessarily be funded ultimately, because we do invite more applications than we fund.
We do try to limit the number of full applications we invite though, because we know that, these applications are a lot of work. It's a time commitment, it's energy to pull all of these pieces together. So we don't want to create more work than is necessary. And if we know that these 30 congregations are the ones that really have the greatest shot of advancing and being funded, then we're going to have that number submit full applications and no more. That's why the number gets winnowed down so much between step 1 and step 2. It's because we want to be considerate of your time.
So there's some questions around specific projects, eligibility of specific projects. So stained glass and window stonework, those definitely we have funded. Restoration or upgrading of chimes and the chimes tower, I think, is probably less likely to be eligible. Review the information on the website and then reach out directly to us if you have questions about that. Renovation of fellowship hall and stage to facilitate better community outreach and involvement. That's definitely the type of project that we like to fund, assuming all the other eligibility criteria are met. And if we're demoing a lot of the old building and rebuilding it, do we qualify for funding? That's probably going to be a no. Rachel, do you want to say anything else about types of projects that we fund or the eligibility criteria?
Nothing specific. I just want to add that like Jennifer mentioned, we recently revamped the website, and there's more complete information that's like ever been on there before. So please do take a look at the guidelines and eligibility on our website. There are complete detailed lists there.
We had a question about applying for multiple grants at the same time. And so I think the question is related to the National Trust Preservation Funds, which are due February 1st, and then this program, which is due March 7th. You certainly can apply for both, but you cannot use funding from other National Trust grant programs to match the National Fund for Sacred Places. So that would include preservation funds. It would include our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, Partners in Preservation, other funds that the National Trust has typically cannot be used to match the National Fund for Sacred Places.
Yeah, and kind of sort of related to that, I had intended to mention this earlier. Partners for Sacred Places is more than a funder. We also do work with congregations on a for-fee basis, mainly around capital campaign consulting and community engagement. It is not uncommon for us to have overlap from time to time. I just want to note that the planning grant cannot be used to pay for partner services. So it can be used to pay for a feasibility study with somebody else, but not with partners.
Okay, so many good questions. If we have two worthy projects that are needing the same amount of funding, would you like to see both in the LOI, or would you prefer we only submit one?
What do you think?
It is tricky. I mean, I think what we like to see is congregations that have done some assessment and some planning. So it's great that you kind of know already that you have multiple priorities. I think most people stewarding old buildings have multiple priorities. That's why, and there were some questions about a facility assessment in here too. That's why those types of assessments are really critical to help congregations determine what is the current condition of their building, and then how should they prioritize the repairs. We don't require that you've done a building condition assessment before you apply, but it's certainly excellent if you have. And to the question about whether or not you include that with your application, at the LOI stage, we don't ask for those documents, I don't believe, but we would ask for them if people were invited to submit a full application. So certainly demonstrate to us, if you can, that you've looked holistically at your building. You're not just responding to, there's a leak in the roof, we need to fix the roof, but you fully understand the interconnected elements of the building and what's causing the issues you're seeing. And then the priority order in which to address those. So certainly there can be more than one priority project at a time. Ideally, you're addressing more than one priority at a time. Maybe your capital campaign is large enough to support both of those priorities. So I don't think there's a need to be exclusionary when you're talking to us about your projects. Tell us what you're looking at, tell us what you think your priorities are. And if this grant's only going to get you halfway there, maybe that's fine. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking about saying a word about the National Fund scope and the maximum cost needed to reach that maximum grant, but I think that would just be getting into the weeds. So let's go with that. I think for now that makes the most sense.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Someone has asked about seeing the application before applying, and we kind of tweak the application every year. So we could probably, if you reach out to us directly, we could probably share last year's application form. But ultimately, it's essentially, there's a lot of similarity to the LOI, but we just are asking for more detailed information under each of those categories. Yeah. Let's see. Well, this is a good question. What is LOI? That is letter of intent. And that is really just the name for this phase of the application process. It is sort of intended to be a less intensive first effort to share with a funder your project and your proposal, and then it potentially leads to invitation to submit a full application, as Rachel has outlined. Okay, let's see. Who or what body makes the decision to move the initial LOI to the next stage? Who or what body makes the decision to accept or fund the submission?
It is the National Fund team that I highlighted on that slide pretty early on in the presentation. So at Partners, it's Bob Yeager, Gianfranco Grande, myself, and Emily. And on the trust side, it's Jennifer, Emily, Olivia, Nikki, and Diana. And then fast forwarding a little to the full application stage, it's that same team plus the advisory committee.
These questions are coming faster than I can get to them. So this may have already been answered, but this is important to be clear about. Is the LOI intended to describe the entire project or just the need for a planning grant to further develop the scope of work for the capital project?
The entire project.
Yes.
Yep, we want to get a holistic sense of exactly where you are.
Does this mean, you mentioned it takes 2 years to work through the program. Does it mean it could be 2 years before you can begin work?
Ideally, no, we don't want that. Typically, it's about 1 year before you begin work, but we've certainly advanced congregations faster than that in the past. From time to time, we accept congregations into the program that are like ready with shovels, and that's good too. But we don't want it to go any longer than that. So a no for the 2 years.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. People are asking if we have examples of an LOI from previous years. I don't think we do have a sample LOI, unfortunately. But you know, as you go through it, if you have any specific questions, we're all here to help support you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have a sample LOI because it's so case specific that it's hard to give definitive answers and set a definitive example. So it's better to just reach out with questions in this case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely agree.
This is a question about supplemental or other capital grants whose funding goals are similar to ours. And I think this also just kind of gets at funding, you know, where does match funding typically come from for these kind of projects, and what other sources of funding can people look to?
It really varies a ton from project to project. Usually the match requires congregations to do fundraising or, you know, conduct a capital campaign. We at Partners believe in the community fundraising approach, which is kind of based on the idea that your buildings are assets to your communities. So therefore, your congregations alone shouldn't be responsible for raising every last cent in order to get these projects done. That's what we teach in our training, and we provide a lot of materials related to that. So many of the congregations who come through the program end up employing that, raising a portion of the funds themselves, but also finding money in the community among stakeholders. From time to time, we've had congregations completely rely on other grants, but that's less common. It usually does require congregations to fundraise.
And related to that, someone's asking about, is it okay to plan to use an outside capital paid fundraising committee or an outside capital campaign consultant to support capital campaigns for these projects?
Yes.
Yeah, and we see that very often, but it's certainly not a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
A question about the timing of the program. The question is this program discontinued in 2023? It's not that it's discontinued, it's just that we received funding enough to support 8 years of the program, and these will be the last 2 of those 8 years. So hopefully we will be able to continue the program after that, but we can't say that for sure.
Yeah, no guarantees.
Yeah. Can we use a fiscal agent? We have seen that from time to time, but I think that's going to be a case specific one as well, to try to, you know, reach out and explain to us the need for that. What would you say, Rachel?
Yeah, I would prefer congregations would steer clear from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a question about timing of engineering work or architectural work. They have some proposals from an engineer, but they have not given authorization to proceed. When would they need to have the engineering completed? Yeah.
So that's kind of a tough one. If you were in the program you would need to have that completed. You'd be able to produce documents for us to review in order to get the first half of your capital grant. So you have a while essentially to complete that. If you want to do it sooner rather than later, that's absolutely great. But in terms of our requirement, we wouldn't need that to be complete until you're ready to apply for your capital campaign or capital grant.
Yeah.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, and I think, to the extent that getting a good sense of how much your project is going to cost can help you fill out the LOI and the application, because it can help you show us that you have a budget, that, you can back up the budget, why it's going to cost that much and what the different elements are going to be, is useful. But if you sign a contract with the engineers and you start the work, then that work wouldn't be eligible for the program. And certainly if it's something urgent, you would want to go ahead and do that. Here's a question about the economic halo effect. Someone would like to know more about that service to participants, and they want to know who to reach out to after the webinar to find out more.
Sure. Yeah, the economic halo effect, it's a methodology that we developed in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. And it looks at 50 plus different factors that can be quantified that are related to the kinds of things that congregations do. So we conduct those studies for individual congregations and cohorts of congregations, and the end result is a report with the annual economic impact number, which we break into different categories. That's a super helpful tool to incorporate into your case statement or marketing materials if you're fundraising, or even into annual stewardship campaigns. So that's something that we offer pro bono to the congregations in the program. But we also do it on a for-fee basis. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I'm before I was the director of the fund, I was the Halo guru, as I was called. So I could direct you to the right person on staff to discuss that further.
All right, well, I see that we are actually reaching the end of our time, but our architect, Olivia Terraconi, is reminding me to be clear and differentiate between the design work and the construction work for the project. So certainly you can do the design work before you're admitted to the program, and that would be, working with your architect or your engineer to outline, the plans and the documents to help you understand exactly what needs to be done, what work needs to be done, but you just can't start, you can't submit the cost to prepare those documents to us because you will have already paid the contractor to generate them, and you can't start the actual construction work or it wouldn't be eligible. Rachel, do you want me to keep going here? I know we're at time and there's so many questions that we really want to be able to get to.
Yeah, let's do 2 or 3 more. And if folks need to leave, they can leave. That's okay, of course.
Okay. There's some questions a little bit about the training, recognizing that congregations are in many different places with their understanding of, how to run capital campaigns or whether they've done large projects like this before, and whether or not the training, may be useful to all congregations, depending on where they are in that trajectory. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we absolutely recognize that congregations are at different places in this process. We definitely take that into consideration as we're developing the training. So we do hope, we aspire to make sure that there's something for everybody there. And at minimum, that opportunity to mix and mingle is really essential. The value of that really can't be understated because you all are, coming in together and doing similar work. There's much to be learned from one another. But yes, of course, some congregations will have an understanding of some of what we're covering and not need certain pieces, while others will need all of it. That's just an inevitability.
Yeah, but I do think we've heard consistently from participants that the training was one of the most valuable aspects of being in the program, even when they felt they had an understanding of what I think that everyone learns something, and particularly because the training is designed for groups of people from congregations. So it's not just one person that's coming to the training. You're coming with several, folks that are leaders in your congregation. You're supporting, them also learning that and disseminating that information more broadly, as they take that back to your congregation. So I think it's valuable in that way too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
A question about if we apply for a specific amount, could a lesser amount still be awarded? And that is important to note. We do ask you to identify the amount of funding you think you would be seeking, but because the amount of funding is not finalized until we accept you into the program and review, all of your documents, it is still sort of a ballpark figure for the amount of funding that you would like to receive. It's not final until we sign a contract.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see if I can find another one to wrap it all up. Well, here's one about location. I think folks had also asked this about when we're making the determination on what projects to accept and how we're balancing sort of geographics and denomination and everything. Does location matter? For instance, if you have funded a project in a city previously, would you consider funding another in the same city?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. If there is a demonstrated need and urgency to the project and you tick all of our boxes in terms of those different criteria, absolutely. Yeah, you have a very good shot at being funded. We do also want to achieve greater diversity in these last 2 years, however, so it's just something to consider as well.
Really difficult decisions to make because we truly have so many outstanding applicants every year.
Yeah.
So I think just to wrap up, there are a lot of questions about, how can people contact us afterwards with follow-up questions?
Here is our contact information. Here's my email and phone number, and here's the trust contact and phone number. Just as a reminder, the deadline is March 7th, midnight Hawaii time. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions if you feel like your question wasn't answered today. We are available to talk with you. And like we said, this slide deck as well as a recording is going to be available on the fund website by the end of the week. That's why we've got this slide here with resources, and you can link to them. Please take a look at these resources. I think they're going to be really valuable for your congregations as you navigate your next steps. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming today and joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Mm-hmm.